In light of the recent news that Chevrolet is apparently going to be releasing an all-new rendition of the iconic Chevelle, God tell me this isn't real, I'm hoping Chevy pulls a Sonic the Hedgehog on this one and just redesigns the whole thing. Anyways, it got me thinking about this idea of retro cars and how rare it is that a company successfully pulls off a compelling retro vehicle. The reason is pretty simple. It's nearly impossible to capture the essence of a car that's some 50 plus years old in modern form. There are so many factors that make this difficult, from the materials used in current automotive manufacturing to stringent safety regulations, which often make it nearly impossible to mimic the lines of those iconic original cars. This is why most manufacturers will simply give, a nod to old styles, maybe a specifically styled bit or similar headlight shape or even engine configuration. All of this is much easier for motorcycles, and it's why there's an entire category, a very lucrative one by the way, dedicated to retro, old school, old styled motorcycles. For me, there's really one car that stands out in terms of retro design from the past 30 or so years. A car that until recently I don't think I ever fully appreciated. This is a vehicle that goes so far beyond just being a styling exercise. It really transcended categories to such a degree, government classifications didn't know what to call it. Is it a truck? Is it a car? So they just called it both. A car whose styling didn't point to one specific model from that company's history, but rather a whole generation of iconic cars. That's right, I'm talking about the Chrysler PT Cruiser. The most important and really useful resource for this video is this great book by Matt DeLorenzo and John Lamb called Chrysler PT Cruiser. I've put a link in the description for you guys so you can easily pick this up for cheap if you want to learn more. It's really well written and well researched and easy to read, which is exactly what I want when I make, videos like this. Now, the PT Cruiser story and development, which was a relatively secret 4-year program, starts with the Dodge Neon and a concept car built on the Neon platform called the Espresso. This car was developed primarily to show off the versatility of the Neon. Though this car was an entirely forgettable, ugly little toy-like minivan hatch car, the key was its proportions. It had a shorter wheelbase and shorter overall length than the Dodge Neon, but it was 15 inches taller than the Neon. And for a very small car, a taller roof meant, potential higher seat height and more space, and really just an experience that gives the driver a command of the road that was just found nowhere else in this compact car segment. And this was really a paradigm shift for this class of vehicle. Despite never going into production, the Espresso would massively impact the design and really the philosophy behind the later PT Cruiser. Alongside this concept car, the Plymouth Pronto would take the idea of a compact car with a sort of minivan feel to the next level, and it would also influence the lines and roof design of the PT Cruiser down the road. Upon the Pronto's unveil, Neil Walling said that the Pronto gives people space where they need space and economy where they would need economy, and that idea would really change this class of vehicle forever. A change in how small cars could be developed could save them altogether, as the world at this time was quickly moving to vans and especially SUVs. This was an alternative to just making small cars bigger. The answer could have more to do with making small cars just shaped different. Now, at the heart of it, the PT Cruiser owes much of its mechanical identity to the Dodge Neon, but DeLorenzo and Lamb's book points out that this was so much more than just a reskinned Neon. From the overall dimensions to even the engine, though export cars would get the same 2.0 double overhead cam 4-cylinder, here in the States we got a 2.4 liter making 150 horsepower, which was no simple task to fit in the small front space of this car. The engine had less than an inch of clearance in the engine bay. But everything, really the suspension, the interior volume, altogether, the PT Cruiser was really a perfect example of a car built on a platform, but really re-engineered and redesigned at every level to make the car feel entirely unique and to feel different. And there were really very few shared components with the Dodge Neon. Now, when it comes to the style of this new car, which was being developed secretly through the mid-90s, There was a lot of debate among the higher-ups at Chrysler as to what direction this car should go. On the one hand, retro-styled cars had worked for Chrysler, from things like the Dodge Viper to the Plymouth Prowler, but this idea of taking a radical new kind of car, this tall, small vehicle, and making it old school, many at Chrysler figured it should just look something like, a tall VW Golf. Those in favor of the retro looks figured that the PT Cruiser just wouldn't stand out, It would essentially look like a mini minivan. Think something like a Honda Fit today. Finally, they were able to land on this look which really evokes American hot rods, after they had experimented with the freestanding fender look of the car and realized that it really looked good. This car really evoked an old world simplicity. Clear, distinct features, a hood, fenders, instead of all of it just kind of being shoved together. It really looked like a car, and it had the simplicity of a 1930s car kind of molded into a modern package, and that's exactly what the PT Cruiser would successfully do, and this is really the time period of cars that it would evoke. The designers talk about how the car was meant to be huggable. At this time, and even today, vehicles are pretty standoffish. Either they're so alien and futuristic looking, or they just have all sorts of elements of aggression throughout the design, whereas the PT Cruiser, it just wasn't playing any of those games. It was an endearing little car. Much of this design is owed to a young designer at the time named Brian Nesbitt. With the hot rod theme at the forefront, coupled with incredible usability, one look at the PT Cruiser with all of its doors and hatch open, and it's clear that this was a step forward for small cars. Sure, it was small, but it was also very roomy and spacious, and confidence-inspiring for the driver. Nesbitt points out the spirit of post-war car design, something that was essentially gone by the time this car came around. He says, it seems that in the larger volume and lower priced cars of today, that individualism has sort of escaped us. We don't seem to put that type of differentiation into products anymore. My generation missed out on the post-war optimism that funneled into a lot of great products. It seems like that's been gone for a while, and this PT Cruiser harkens back to that optimism in a way. What he's essentially saying is that at that time, designers were excited to build cars that weren't necessarily going to sell, 5-10 million units. And so they were more interested in making cars that were just interesting, that were different, and that, like he said, evoked some kind of individualism. In line with the exterior, the PT Cruiser's interior was thoroughly retro-inspired as well. It incorporated vintage-inspired details like a large round speedometer, chrome accents, a cue ball shifter, and a color-matched dashboard with a really nostalgic feel reminiscent of classic cars from the 1930s and the 1940s. As we've said, it offered a high roofline and upright seating, which created a roomy and comfortable cabin. The rear seats were also versatile, allowing for different configurations, such as folding flat to provide more cargo space. It had a distinctive high seating position, similar to that of an SUV, which gave the driver and passengers a really commanding view of the road for such a small car. This contributed to a sense of openness and really provided good visibility. The interior featured high-quality materials and finishes, giving the cabin a more upscale feel. Soft touch surfaces and well-appointed seats added to the comfort of the vehicle. Overall, the Chrysler PT Cruiser's interior was really a blend of retro styling, spaciousness, and practicality. Its distinctive design and flexible configuration made it a standout choice in this segment, appealing to those who wanted a compact car that was high quality, but that also had a touch of nostalgia and a comfortable, functional interior. And because of all this, it was a pretty pricey car, about $20,000 when it came out. Now, there was no guarantee that a thoroughly American-styled American heritage car would work not only in America, but especially, overseas. Cars in the US were still, in general, significantly larger than those in Europe. Those involved with the design of the PT Cruiser were hoping to accomplish two things: making the small hatch cool and desirable here in America, a place where these cars weren't really very desirable, but also making not just another boring utilitarian vehicle, making it a truly usable standout small car for all markets. Chrysler tested out European tastes at the 1998 Geneva Auto Show with a tricky 3-door concept car called the Pronto Cruiser, spelled with a Z. meant not only to throw off the competition with its odd form, as it really wasn't exactly what the PT Cruiser was, but it did have that old school roadster style. And it was mainly to see if this hot rod retro styling was at all appealing to European customers. And in short, it was a hit. Most who saw it liked it and really got what Chrysler was trying to do with the design language. A surprise unveil of the North American concept car called the PT Cruiser, also spelled with a Z, was set for the 1999 North American Auto Show. And the response there was overwhelmingly positive. So much interest was created by this unique little car, Chrysler decided to move forward immediately with production for the 2000 lineup. Now, through its 10-year life, Chrysler would make some 1.3 million PT Cruisers in various forms. The car was popular among a diverse group of enthusiasts. For as many owners who bought it because they thought it was cool, there were just as many people who were more interested in its practicality, and a whole lot of goofballs wanting to do hot rod things to what is essentially a wannabe hot rod. The PT Cruiser would be massively influential, from, Chevy's car that basically is a copy of it, to all sorts of other odd retro vehicles that came out at this time. Some also point to the PT Cruiser as the first crossover, and in many ways this is probably its greatest influence on the industry as a whole. And we could point mainly to the Cruiser's influence on the small car market for its radical dimensions, making it kind of a new kind of spacious compact car. In many ways, there is no Honda Fit, for example, without something like the PT Cruiser. But for me, it's the old school design that really stands out and that's interesting to talk about. It's retro, not just in looks. It's not about making a car that kind of looks old. It's about the spirit behind the whole project that feels very old world. And I think this really gets at the heart of this car, and mainly how polarizing it is. You either love it or you hate it. And that's because it stands out. It's not just another boring corporate design that doesn't catch your eye at all. I think it's similar in spirit to some of the Studebaker designs of the 50s and 60s. Those cars and trucks were very different, and man, there were probably just as many people cringing at those cars in their day as there were people drooling over them because they were just so unique. But that's okay. Not every car needs to be for every person, and if there's enough manufacturers out there bold enough to make interestingly designed vehicles, then even if you don't like this car, there's going to be something that's perfect for you. Sadly, it doesn't seem like many companies took note of the PT Cruiser and its success. Sure, there was a resurgence of, retro-styled vehicles at this time, but small cars are as boring and soulless as ever. And it's been a while since I've seen a major manufacturer come out with an entirely new compact car that really feels like its own thing, and it's not just a tiny version of whatever larger vehicles are being made by that company. But if the PT Cruiser was so great, then why did Chrysler stop making it? Well, in many ways, by the mid-2000s, the novelty of this retro-designed car was really wearing off, and sales were reflecting that change in the market. From a rather ugly convertible version to factory flame decals, the PT Cruiser quickly became as dated as the cars that it was imitating. Not to mention, the car was never exactly affordable. Quality was at the forefront for Chrysler, but it was hard to justify when the MSRP was about $20,000 at launch and upwards of, $30,000 in its highest form later on. $20,000 in 2000 is about $35,000 today, which is pretty hard to imagine paying for a small car. As a driver's car, it didn't exactly handle particularly well. It wasn't the funnest vehicle. It was difficult to work on, and it wasn't near as reliable as other cars in this class at this time. Pre-2008 recession, many dealers were selling these not inexpensive cars with no money down at really high interest rates, and over time, they would depreciate at such high rates. All in all, there's many reasons why the PT Cruiser died. It's not one simple thing, but honestly, with how radical it was, it could have easily lived for like a year. And I think the reason it lasted as long as it did is because it really was a car that stood out, and it did have something beneficial, mainly that sort of spaciousness. And all in all, the PT Cruiser was a success. There's no denying that. As much as I personally made fun of these cars and other retro cars from this time when I first started driving back in 2008, now looking back, I think it's just easy to hate on things that are different. Like most unique cars through history that have had, their own life and then ultimately die, it's all more interesting and easier to appreciate when you dig in and find out why a certain car is the way it is, And that's one of the great things about that book that I mentioned. It was written pretty much at the release of the PT Cruiser at a time when everyone was so excited and it felt like this was the most revolutionary car ever. So the book is so optimistic, but because of that, it gives you a very positive and interesting look at a car that essentially became, just kind of hated. And one has to wonder if retro-styled cars, much like the cars they're trying to point to and emulate, will have their day, and maybe we'll all completely move on from this idea of making cars that look old. But I think the PT Cruiser nailed the good aspects of a retro car. It wasn't just a cheap imitation of something old, but rather a new take on an old spirit. And one has to wonder if that idea could work today in interesting ways. I still find something like the PT Cruiser much more compelling than just throwing an old iconic name at a new car that has absolutely nothing to do with that original vehicle just for sales. Yes, I'm looking at you, Ford Mustang Mach-E. If retro-inspired car designs are here to stay, there's no denying that the PT Cruiser should be a point of research for those wishing to make this kind of car work. I think the main lesson learned is that these cars have to do more than just point back. They need to be exceptional and fill some kind of niche in their own right. And a retro design can really only be the icing on the cake. Well, I'd love to hear from you guys. Have you had any experience with this odd little retro car? Heck, maybe you bought one new and still drive it today. More likely, you owned a cheap used one at one point and moved on to something else. Regardless, let us know your experience in the comments below, and as always, drive safe.